Hello, guys and girls. So, gonna finish off reading Haunting of Hill House tonight. The last two chapters, so chapters 8 and 9. And I just got a notification about it. Nice. So I hope you are all well in the chat and had a good Christmas. And I'll make a start. What I'll probably do is do the first chapter and then have a break for a few minutes. Hey, Clement, how are you? Welcome. Okay, so chapter 8. Did anyone tell them that Mrs. Dudley cleans at 10? Theodora looked into the coffee pot speculatively. The doctor hesitated. I hate to wake them after such a night. But Mrs. Dudley clears at 10. They're coming, Elena said. I can hear them on the stairs. Hello, Julie. How are you? Welcome to the stream. I hope you had a good Christmas. I can hear them on the stairs. I can hear them everywhere. I can hear everything all over the house, she wanted to tell them. Then distinctly they could hear Mrs. Montague's voice raised in irritation, and Luke, realizing, said, Oh, Lord, they can't find the dining room, and hurried out to the open doors. Properly aired. Mrs. Montague's voice preceded her, and she swept into the dining room, tapped the doctor curtly on the shoulder by way of greeting, and seated herself with a genuine nod to the others. I must say, she began at once, that I think you might have called us for breakfast. I suppose everything is cold. Is the coffee bearable? Good morning, Arthur said silkily, and sat himself down with an air of silly ill temper. Theodora almost upset the coffee pot in her haste to set up a cup of coffee before Mrs. Montague. It seems hot enough, Mrs. Montague said. I shall speak to you, Mrs. Dudley, this morning in any case. That room must be aired. And you're right, the doctor asked timidly. And you're right, the doctor asked timidly. Did you spend a profitable night? If by profitable you meant comfortable, John, I wish you would say so. No, in answer to your most civil inquiry, I did not spend a comfortable night. I did not sleep a wink. The room is unendurable. Noisy old house, isn't it? Arthur said. Branch kept tapping against my window all night, nearly drove me crazy, tapping and tapping. Even with the windows open, the room is stuffy. Mrs. Dudley's coffee is not as poor as her housekeeping. Oh, that's a bit of a dig. Another cup, if you please. I am astonished, John, that you put me in a room not properly aired. If there is to be any communication with those beyond the air calculation, at least ought to be adequate, I should say. I smelled dust all night. Can't understand you, Arthur said to the doctor, letting yourself get all nervy about this place. Sat there all night long with my revolver, and not a mouse stirred, except for that inferior branch tapping on the window. Nearly drove me crazy, he confided to Theodora. We will not give up hope, of course, Mrs. Montague scowled at her husband. Perhaps tonight there may be some manifestations. Theo? Elena put her notepad and Theodora put down her notepad and Theodora busily looked up with a frown. I've been thinking about something. I hate writing these notes. I feel like a damn fool trying to write this crazy stuff. I've been wondering. Well, Theodora smiled a little. You look so serious, she said. Are you coming to some great decision? Yes, Elena said, deciding about what I'm going to do afterwards, after we all leave Hill House. Well, I'm coming with you, Elena said. Come with me? Back with you, back home. And Elena smiled wearily, am going to follow you home. Theodora stared. Why? She asked blankly. I never had anyone to care about, Elena said, wondering where she had heard someone say something like this before. I want to be someplace where I belong. I am not in the habit of taking stray cats, Theodora said lightly. Elena laughed too. I am kind of a stray cat, aren't I? Well, Theodora took up her pencil again. You have your own home, she said. You'll be glad enough to get back to it when the time comes. Now, my Nelly, I suppose we'll all be glad to get back home. What are you saying about these noises late last night? I can't describe them. I'll come, you know, Elena said. I'll just come. Nelly, Nelly. Theodora laughed again. Look, she said, this is just a summer. Just a few weeks' visit to a lovely old summer resort in the country. You have your life back home. I have mine. When the summer is over, we go back. We'll write each other, of course, and maybe visit. But Hill House is not forever, you know. I can get a job. I won't be in your way. I don't understand. Theodora threw down her pencil in expectoration. Do you always go where you're not wanted? Elena smiled placidly. I've never been wanted anywhere, she said. It's all so motherly, Luke said. Everything's so soft. Everything's so padded. Great embracing chairs and sofas, which turn out to be hard and unwelcome when you sit down and reject you at once. Theo, Elena said softly, and Theodora looked up at her and shook her head in bewilderment, and hands everywhere. Little soft glass hands curving out to you, beckoning. Theo, Elena said. No, Theodora said. I won't have you, and I don't want to talk about it anymore. Perhaps, Luke said, watching them, the single most repulsive aspect is the emphasis upon the globe. I ask you to regard impartially the lampshade made of tiny pieces of broken glass glued together, or the great round balls of the lights upon the stairs, or the fluted incense candy jar at Theo's elbow. In the dining room there is a bowl of particularly filthy yellow glass resting upon the cupped hands of a child, and an Easter egg of sugar with a vision of sharp heads dancing inside. A blossoming lady supports the stair rail on her head, and the and under glass in the drawing room. Nelly, leave me alone. Let's walk down to the brook or something. A child's face done in cross stitch. Now, don't look so apprehensive. Theo has only suggested that you walk down to the brook. If you like, I will go along. Anything, Theodora said. To frighten away rabbits, if you like, I will carry a stack. If you like, I will not come at all. Theo has only to say the word. Theodora laughed. Perhaps now would rather stay here and write on walls. So unkind, Luke said. Callous of you, Theo. I want to hear more about the shepherds dancing in the Easter egg, Theodora said. A world contained in sugar, 6 very tiny shepherds dancing, and shepherdess in pink and blue reclining upon a mousy bank enjoying them. There are flowers and trees and sheep and an old gopher playing pipes. I would like to have been a gopher, and I think. If you were not a bullfighter, Theodora said, if you were not a bullfighter, now's affairs are the talk of the calves, you will recall. Pan, Theodore said, you should live in a hollow tree, Luke. Now, Luke said, you are not listening. I think you frighten her, Luke. Because Hill House will be mine someday with its untold treasures and its cushions. I am not gentle with a house now. I might take a fit of restlessness and smash the sugar Easter egg, or shatter the little child's hands, or go stomping and shouting up and down the stairs, striking at glued glass lamps with a cane and slashing at the bosomy lady with a suitcase on her head. I might. You see, you do frighten her. I believe I do, Luke said. Now I am talking nonsense. I don't think he even owns a cane, Theodora said. As a matter of fact, I do. Now I am only talking nonsense. What is she thinking about, Theo? Theodora said carefully, she wants me to take her home with me after we leave Hill House, and I won't do it. Luke laughed. Poor silly now, she said. Journeys ends in lovers' meetings. Let's go down to the brook. A mother house, Luke said, as they came down the steps from the Theodora to the lawn. A house mother, a headmistress, or a house mistress. I am sure I will be very poor, a very poor housemaster, like our Arthur when Hill House belongs to me. I can't understand someone wanting to own Hill House, Theodora said, and Luke turned and looked back with amusement at the house. You never know what you are going to want until you see it clearly, he said. If I never had a chance of owning it, I might feel very differently. What do people really want with each other? As Nell asked me once, what use are other people? It was my fault my mother died, Elena said. She knocked on the wall and called me, and I never woke up. I ought to have brought her the medicine. I always did before. But this time she called me, and I never woke up. You should have forgotten all that by now, Theodora said. I've wondered ever since if I did wake up and hear her, and if I just went back to sleep. It would have been easy, and I have wondered about it. Turn here, Luke said, if you're going to the brook. You worry too much now. You probably just like thinking it was all your fault. It was going to happen sooner or later in any case, Elena said. But of course, no matter when it happened, it was going to be my fault. If it hadn't happened, you would never have come to Hill House. We go single file along here, Luke said. Now, go first. Smiling, Elena went on ahead, knocking her feet comfortably along the path. Now I know where I am going, she thought. I told her about my mother, so that's all right. I will find a little house, or maybe an apartment like hers. I will see her every day and we will go searching together for lovely things. Gold trimmed dishes and a white cat and a sugar Easter egg and a cup of stars. I will not be frightened or alone any more. I will call myself just Eleanor. Are you two talking about me? She asked over her shoulder. After a minute, Luke answered politely, a struggle between good and evil for the soul of now. I suppose I will have to be God, however. But of course she cannot trust either of us, Theodora said, amused. Not me, certainly, Luke said. Besides, now, Theodora said, we were not talking about you at all. As though I were the game's mistress, she said, half angry to Luke. I have waited such a long time, Elena was thinking. I have finally earned my happiness. She came leading them to the top of the hill and looked down to the slim line of trees they must pass through to get to the brook. They are lovely against the sky, she thought, so straight and free. Luke was wrong about the softness everywhere, because the trees are hard like wooden trees. They are still talking about me, talking about how I came to Hill House and found Theodora and now will not let her go. Behind her, she could hear the murmur of their voices, edged sometimes with malice, sometimes rising in mockery, sometimes touched with a laughter, almost of kinship, and she walked on dreamily, hearing them come behind. She could tell when they entered the tall grass a minute after she did, because the grass moved hissingly beneath their feet, and startled grasshopper leaped wildly away. I could help her in the shop, Elena thought. She loves beautiful things, and I would go with her to find them. We could go anywhere we pleased, to the edge of the world if we liked, and come back when we wanted to. He is telling her now what he knows about me, that I am not easily taken in, that I am an Ordalia wall around me, and she is laughing because I am not going to be lonely any more. They are very much alike, and they are very kind. I would not really have expected as much from them as they are giving me. I was very right to come because journeys end in lovers' meeting. She came under the hard branches of the trees, and the shadows were pleasantly cool after the hot sun on the path. Now she had to walk more carefully because the path led downhill and there were sometimes rocks and roots across her way. Behind their voices went on, quick and sharp, and then more slowly and laughing. I will not look back, she thought happily, because then they would know what I am thinking. We will talk about it together some day, Theo and I, when we have plenty of time. How strange I feel, she thought, coming out of the trees onto the last steep part of the path going down to the brook. I am caught in a kind of wonder. I am still with joy. I will not look around until I am next to the brook where she almost fell the day we came. I will remind her about the golden fish in the brook and about our panic. She sat down on the narrow green bank and put her chin on her knees. I will not forget this one moment in my life, she promised herself, listening to their voices and their footsteps coming slowly down the hill. Hurry up, she said, turning her head to look for Theodora. And was silent. There was no one on the hill, nothing but the footsteps coming clearly along the path and the faint mocking laughter. Who? She whispered. Who? She could see the grass go down under the weight of the footsteps. She saw another grasshopper leap wildly away, and a pebble jar and roll. She heard clearly the brush of footsteps on the path, and then standing back hard against the bank, heard the laughter very close. Elena, Elena, and she said it inside and outside her head. This was a call she had been listening for all her life. The footsteps stopped, and she was caught in a movement of air so solid caught in the movement of air so solid that she staggered and was held. Elena, Elena, she heard through the rushing of air past her ears. Elena, Elena, and she was held tight and safe. It is not cold at all, she thought. It was not cold at all. She closed her eyes and leaned back against the bank and thought, don't let me go. And then stay, as the firmness which held her slipped away, leaving her and fading. Elena, Elena, she heard once more, and then she stood beside the brook, shivering as though the sun had gone, watching without surprise the vacant footsteps move across the water of the brook, sending small ripples going and then over onto the grass on the other side, moving slowly and carelessly up and down the hill. Come back, she almost said, standing shaking by the brook, and then she turned and ran madly up the hill, crying as she ran and calling, Theo, Luke. She found them in the little group of trees, leaning against a tree trunk and talking softly and laughing. When she ran to them, they turned, startled, and Theodora was almost angry. What on earth do you want this time? She said. I waited for you by the brook. We decided to stay here where it was cool, Theodora said. We thought you heard us calling you. Didn't we, Luke? Oh, yes, said Luke, embarrassed. We were sure you heard us calling. Anyway, Theodora said, we were going to come along in a minute, weren't we, Luke? Yes, said Luke, grinning. Oh, yes. Subterranean waters, the doctor said, waving his fork. Nonsense. Does Mrs. Dudley do all this cooking? The asparagus is more than passable. Arthur, let that young man help you to asparagus. My dear, the doctor looked fondly upon his wife. It has become our custom to rest for an hour or so after lunch, if you... Certainly not. I have far too much to do while I am here. I must speak to your cook. I must see that my room is aired. I must ready Platchett for another session this evening. Arthur must clear his revolver, or clean his revolver. Mark of a fighting man, Arthur conceded. Firearms always in good order. You and these young people may rest, of course. Perhaps you do not feel the urgency which I do, the terrible compulsion to aid whatever poor souls wander restlessly here. Perhaps you find me foolish in my sympathy for them. Perhaps I am even more ludicrous in your eyes because I can spare a tear for a lost, abandoned soul, left without any helping hand, pure love. Croquet? Luke said hastily. Croquet, perhaps? He looked eagerly from one to another. Badminton? He suggested. Croquet? Subterranean waters, Theodore added helpfully. No fancy sauces for me, Arthur said firmly. Tell me, fellows, it's the mark of a cad. He looked thoughtfully at Luke. Mark of a cad. Fancy sauces, women waiting on you. My fellows wait on themselves. Mark of a man, he said to Theodora. And what else do you teach them? Theodora asked politely. Teach? You mean, do they learn anything, my fellows? You mean algebra, like Latin? Certainly. Arthur sat back, pleased. Leave all that kind of thing to the teachers, he explained. And how many fellows are there in your school? Theodora leaned forward, curious, interested, making conversation with the guest, and Arthur basked. At the head of the table, Mrs. Montague frowned and tapped her fingers impatiently. How many? How many? Got a crack tennis team, you know. He beamed on Theodora. Crack. Absolutely top hole. Not counting milkshops. Not counting, said Theodora. Milksops. Oh, tennis. Golf. Baseball. Track. Cricket. He smiled shyly. Didn't guess we played cricket, did you? Then there's swimming and volleyball. Some fellows go out for everything, though, he told her anxiously. All around types, maybe 70 altogether. Arthur, Mrs. Montague could contain herself no longer. No shop talk now. You're on vacation, remember? Yes, silly of me, Arthur smiled fondly. Got to check the weapons, he explained. It's 2:00, Mrs. Dudley said in the doorway. I cleaned off at 2. Okay, just give me a minute. Let's see. Hope you guys are okay in the chat and enjoying the stream. Okay. Just take a swig of coffee. Theodora laughed, and Elena, hidden deep in the shadows behind the summer house, put her hands over her mouth to keep from speaking to them. No, she was there. to let them know she was there. I've got to find out, she was thinking. I've got to find out. It's called the Gretton Murders, Luke was saying. Lovely thing. I can even sing it if you prefer. Mark of a cad. Theodora laughed again. Poor Luke, I would have said scoundrel. If you would rather be spending this brief hour with Arthur, of course I would rather be with Arthur. An educated man is always an enlivening companion. Cricket, Luke said. Never would have thought we played cricket, would you? Sing, sing, Theodora said, laughing. Luke sang in a nasal monotone, emphasizing each word distinctly. Oh, God, I might have to sing now. The first was young Mrs. Gretna. She tried not to let him in. He stabbed her with a corn knife. That's how his crimes began. The next was Grandma Gretna, so old and tired and grey. She fit off her attacker until her strength give way. The next was Grandpa Gretna, a settling by the fire. He crept up close behind him and strangled him with a wire. The last was baby Gretna, all in his trundle bed. He stove him in the short ribs until that child was dead. Oh shit. And spit tobacco juice all on his golden head. Holy cow. Oh, I can't think why that was in the top 10 hit. When he finished, there was a moment's silence, and Theodora said weakly, It's lovely, Luke. Perfectly beautiful. I will never hear it again without thinking of you. I plan to sing it to Arthur, Luke said. When are they going to talk about me? Elena wondered in the shadows. After a minute, Luke went on idly. I wonder what the doctor's book will be like when he writes it. Did you suppose he'll put us in? You will probably turn up as an earnest young psychic researcher, and I will be a lady of undeniable gifts but dubious reputation. I wonder if Mrs. Montague will have a chapter to herself, and Arthur, and Mrs. Dudley. I hope he doesn't reduce us all to figures of a graph. I wonder, said Luke. It's warm this afternoon, he said. What could we do that is cool? We could ask Mrs. Dudley to make lemonade. You know what I want to do, Luke said. I want to explore. Let's follow the brook up into the hills and see where it comes from. Maybe there's a pond somewhere and we can go swimming, or a waterfall, or it looks like a brook that runs naturally from a waterfall. Come on then. Listening behind the summer house, Elena heard their laughter and the sound of their feet running down the path to the house. Here's an interesting thing here, Arthur's voice said in the manner of one endeavouring valiant to entertain. Here in this book says how to make candles out of ordinary children's crayons. Interesting, the doctor sounded wary. If you will excuse me, Arthur, I have all these notes to write up. Sure, Doctor. All got our own work to do. Not a sound. Elena, listening outside the parlour door, heard the small, irritating noises of Arthur settling down to be quiet. Not much to do around here, is there? Arthur said. How do you pass the time generally? Working, the doctor said shortly. You writing down what happens in the house? Yes. You got me in there? No. Seems like you ought to put in our notes from the platitude. Where are you writing now? What are you writing now? Arthur, can you read or something? Sure. Never meant to make a nuisance of myself. Elena heard Arthur take up a book and put it down and light a cigarette and sigh and stir and finally say, Listen, isn't there anything to do around here? Where is everybody? The doctor spoke patiently but without interest. Theodora and Luke have gone to explore the brook, I think, and I suppose the others are around somewhere. As a matter of fact, I believe my wife was looking for Mrs. Dudley. Oh, Arthur sighed again. Might as well read, I guess, he said, and then after a minute, Say, Doctor, I don't like to bother you, but listen to what it says here in this book. No, Mrs. Montague said, I do not believe in throwing young people together promiscuously, Mrs. Dudley. If my husband had consulted me before arranging this fantastic house party, well now, it was Mrs. Dudley's voice, and Elena, pressed against the dining room door, stared and opened her mouth wide against the wooden panels of the door. I always say, Mrs. Montague, that you're only young once. Those young people are enjoying themselves, and it's only natural for the young. But living under one roof? It's not as though they weren't grown up enough to know right from wrong. That pretty Theodora lady is old enough to take care of herself. I'd think no matter how gay Mr. Luke, I need a dry dish towel, Mrs. Dudley, for the silverware. It's a shame. I think the way children grow up these days, knowing everything, there should be more mysteries for them, more things that belong rightly to grown-ups that they have to wait to find out. Then they find them out the hard way. Mrs. Dudley's voice was comfortable and easy. Dudley brought in these tomatoes from the garden this morning, she said. They did well this year. Shall I start on them? Oh, no. You sit down over there and rest. You've done enough. I've put on the water and we'll have a nice cup of tea. Journeys end in lovers' meeting, Luke said, and smiled across the room at Elena. Does that blue dress on Theo really belong to you? I've never seen it before. I am Elena, Theodora said wickedly, because I have a beard. You were wise to bring clothes for two, Luke told Elena. Theo would never have looked half so well in that old blazer. I am Elena, Theo said, because I am wearing blue. I love my love with an E because she is ethereal. Her name is Elena, and she lives in expectation. She is being spiteful, Elena thought remotely. From a great distance, it seemed she could watch these people and listen to them. Now she thought, Theo is being spiteful and Luke is trying to be nice. Luke is ashamed of himself for laughing at me, and he is ashamed of Theo for being spiteful. Luke, Theodora said with a half glance at Elena, come and sing to me again. Later, Luke said uncomfortably. The doctor has just set up the dress room. He turned away in some haste. Theodora peeked, leaned her head against the back of her chair, and closed her eyes, clearly determined not to speak. Elena sat, looking down at her hands, and listened to the sounds of the house. Somewhere upstairs, a door swung quietly shut. A bird touched the tower briefly and flew off. In the kitchen, the stove was settling and cooling with a little soft crackings. An animal, a rabbit, moved through the bushes by the summer house. She could even hear, with her new awareness of the house, the dust drifting gently in the attics, the wood aging. Only the library was closed to her. She could not hear the heavy breathing of Mrs. Montague and Arthur over their pursuit, nor their little excited questions. She could not hear the books rotting on or rust seeping into the circular iron stairway to the hall. In the little parlour she could hear, without raising her eyes, Theodora's small irritated tappings and the quiet sound of the chessmen being sat down. She heard when the library door slammed open, and then the sharp, angry sound of footsteps come into the little parlour, and then all of them turned as Mrs. Montague opened the door and marched in. "I must say," said Mrs. Montague, on a sharp, explosive breath, I really must say that this is the most infuriating—" "My dear," the doctor rose, but Mrs. Montague waved him aside angrily. The doctor rose, but "If you had the decency," she said. Arthur, coming behind her, sheepishly moved past her and almost sleekly settled in the chair by the fire. He shook his head warningly when Theodora turned to him. "The common decency. After all, John, I did come all this way, and so did Arthur, just to help out. And I certainly must say that I never expected to meet with such a cynicism and incredulity from you. Of all people, and these," she gestured at Elena and Theodora and Luke, all I ask is some small minimum of trust, just a little bit of sympathy for all I am trying to do. Instead, you disbelieve, you scoff, you mock and jeer." Breathing heavily, red-faced, she shook her finger at the doctor. "Platitude," she said bitterly, "will not speak to me tonight. Not one single word have I heard from Platitude as a direct result of your sneering and your scepticism. Platitude may very well possibly not speak to me for a matter of weeks. It has happened before. I can tell you it has happened before, when I subjected it to the taunts of unbelievers. I have known Platitude to be silent for weeks, and the very least I could have expected coming here, as I did with none but the finest motivations, was a little respect." She shook her finger at the doctor, wordless for the moment. "My dear," the doctor said, "I am certain that none of us would knowingly have interfered. Mocking and jeering you were not, sceptical with Platitude's very words before your eyes. Those young people, pet and insolent." "Mrs. Montague, really," said Luke. But Mrs. Montague brushed past him and sat herself down, her lips tight and her eyes blazing. The doctor sighed, startled to speak, and then stopped. Turning away from his wife, he gestured Luke back to the chess table. Apprehensively, Luke followed, and Arthur, waggling in his chair, said in a low voice to Theodora, "Never seen her so upset, you know. Miserable experience, waiting for Platitude. So easily offended, of course. Sensitive to atmosphere." Seeming to believe that he had satisfyingly explained the situation, he sat back and smiled timidly. Elena was hardly listening, wondering dimly at the movement in the room. Someone was walking around, she thought, without interest. Luke was walking back and forth in the room, talking softly to himself, surely an odd way to play chess. Humming, singing. Once or twice she almost made out a broken word, and then Luke spoke. Quietly, he was at the chess table where he belonged, and Elena turned and looked at the empty centre of the room, where someone was walking and singing softly, and then she heard it clearly. Go walking through the valley. Go walking through the valley. Go walking through the valley, as we have done before. Why, I know that, she thought, listening, smiling to the faint melody. We used to play that game. I remember that. It's simply that it's a most delicate and intricate piece of machinery. Mrs. Montague was saying to Theodora. She was still angry, but visibly suffering under Theodora's sympathetic attention. The slightest air of disbelief offends it naturally. How would you feel if people refused to believe in you? Go in and out the windows. Go in and out the windows. Go in and out the windows, as we have done before. The voice was light, perhaps only a child's voice, singing sweetly and thinly on the barest breath, and Elena smiled and remembered hearing the little song more clearly than Mrs. Montague's voice continuing about platitude. Go forth and face your lover. Go forth and face your lover. Go forth and face your lover, as we have done before. She heard the little melody fade and felt the slight movement of air as the footsteps came close to her, and something almost brushed her face. Perhaps there was a tiny sigh against her cheek, and she turned in surprise. Luke and the doctor bent over the chessboard. Arthur leaned confidingly close to Theodora, and Mrs. Montague talked. None of them heard it, she thought with joy. Nobody heard it but me. Okay, so that's the end of that chapter. So one more chapter now. I'll take about a 10-minute break and then I'll make a start on the last chapter, chapter 9. Take a drinks break. And I will be streaming tomorrow night. I'll be watching Die Hard with a Vengeance tomorrow, because I did the previous two movies on streams before. So we'll be doing the third Die Hard tomorrow. back in a minute. There won't be enough. Couple more minutes and then I'll start the last chapter. Readalong. Let them know it's Christmas time. Readalong. I got that song stuck in my head because I was watching a program that featured it earlier. Oh, Grey's Anatomy is still going. Season 21 coming up. Hell yeah, baby. Maybe it should never end. Okay, chapter 9, last chapter. Elena closed the bedroom door softly behind her, not wanting to awaken Theodora. Although the noise of the door closing would hardly disturb anyone, she thought, who slept so soundly as Theodora. I learned to sleep very lightly, she told herself confrontingly, when I was listening for my mother. The hall was dim, lighted only by the small nightlight over the stairs, and all the doors were closed. Funny, Elena thought, going soundlessly into her bare feet along the hall carpet. It's the only house I ever knew where you don't have to worry about making noise at night, or at least about anyone knowing it's you. She had awakened with the thought of going down to the library, and her mind had supplied her with a reason. I cannot sleep, she explained to herself, and so I am going downstairs to get a book. If anyone asks me where I am going, it is down to the library to get a book because I cannot sleep. It was warm, drowsily, luxuriously warm. She went barefoot and in silence down the great staircase and to the library door before she thought, but I can't go in there. I'm not allowed in there, and recoiled in the doorway before the odour of decay which nauseated her. Mother, she said aloud, and stepped quickly back. Come along, a voice answered distinctively upstairs, and Elena turned, eager, and hurried to the staircase. Mother, she said softly, and then again, Mother. A little soft laugh floated down to her, and she ran breathlessly up the stairs and stopped at the top, looking to right and left along the hallway at the closed doors. You're in here somewhere, she said, and down the hall the little echo went slipping in a whisper on the tiny currents of air. Somewhere, it said, somewhere. Laughing, Helena followed, running soundlessly down the hall to the nursery doorway. The cold spot was gone, and she laughed up at the two grinning faces looking down at her. Are you there? She whispered outside the door. Are you in here? And knocked, pounding with her fists. Yes, it was Mrs. Montague inside, clearly just awakened. Yes, come in, whatever you are. No, no, Elena thought, hugging herself and laughing silently. Not in there, not with Mrs. Montague, and slipped away down the hall, hearing Mrs. Montague behind her, calling, I am your friend. I intend you no harm. Come in and tell me what is troubling you. She won't open her door, Elena thought wisely. She's not afraid, but she won't open her door, and knocked pounding against Arthur's door and heard Arthur's awakening gasp. Dancing, the carpet soft under her feet, she came to the door behind which Theodora slept. Faithless Theo, she thought, cruel laughing. Theo, wake up, wake up, wake up, and pounded and slapped the door, laughing, and shook the doorknob and ran swiftly down the hall to Luke's door and pounded. Wake up, she thought, wake up and be faithless. None of them will open their doors, she thought. They will sit inside with the blankets pressed around them, shivering and wondering what is going to happen to them next. Wake up, she thought, pounding on the doctor's door. I dare you to open your door and come out to see me dancing in the hall of Hill House. Then Theodora startled her by calling out wildly, Now? Now? Doctor? Luke? Now's not here. Poor house, Elena thought. I had forgotten Elena. Now they will have to open their doors. And she ran quickly down the stairs, hearing behind her the doctor's voice raised anxiously, and Theodora calling, Now? Elena? What fools they are, she thought. Now I will have to go inside the library. Mother, mother, she whispered, mother, and stopped at the library door, sick. Behind her she could hear them talking upstairs in the hall. Funny, she thought, I can feel the whole house, and heard even Mrs. Montague's protesting, and Arthur, and then the doctor clearly. We've got to look for her. Everyone, please hurry. Well, I can hurry too, she thought, and ran down the corridor to the little parlour where the fire flickered briefly at her when she opened the door, and the chessmen sat where Luke and the doctor had left their game. The scarf Theodora had been wearing lay across the back of her chair. I can take care of that too, Elena thought. Her maid's pathetic finery and put one end of it between her teeth and pulled, tearing, and then dropped it when she heard them behind her on the stairs. They were coming down all together, anxious, telling one another where to look first now, and then calling, Elena, now, coming, coming. She heard far away, somewhere else in the house, and she heard the stairs shake under their feet and a cricket stir on the lawn. Daring, gay, she ran down the corridor again to the hall and peeked out at them from the doorway. They were moving purposely, all together, straining to stay near one another, and the doctor's flashlight swept the hall and stopped at the great front door, which was standing open wide. Then, in a rush, calling, Elena, Elena, they ran all together across the hall and out the front door, looking and calling, the flashing moving busily. Elena clung to the door and laughed till tears came into her eyes. What fools they are, she thought. We trick them so easily. They are so slow and so deaf and so heavy. They trample over the house, poking and peering and rough. She ran across the hall and through the game room and into the dining room and from there into the kitchen with its doors. It's good here, she thought. I can go in any direction when I hear them. When they came back into the front hall, blundering and calling her, she darted quickly out onto the Theodora into the cool night. She stood with her back against the door, the little mists of Hill House curling around her ankles, and looked up at the pressing heavy hills, gathered comfortably into the hills, she thought, protected and warm. Hill House is lucky. Elena? They were very close, and she ran along the Theodora and darted into the drawing room. Hugh Crane, she said, will you come and dance with me? She curtsied to the huge leaning statue, and its eyes flickered and shone at her. Little reflected lights touched the figurines and the gilded chairs, and she danced gravely before Hugh Crane, who watched her gleaming. Go in and out the windows. She sang and felt her hands taken as she danced. Go in and out the windows. And she danced out onto the Theodora and around the house. Going around and around and around the house, she thought, and none of them can see me. She touched the kitchen door as she passed, and 6 miles away Mrs. Dudley shuddered in her sleep. She came to the tower, held so tightly in the embrace of the house, in the straining grip of the house, and walked slowly past its grey stones, not allowed to touch even the outside. Then she turned and stood before the great doorway. The door was closed again, and she put her hand and opened it effortlessly. Thus I enter Hill House, she told herself, and stepped inside as though it were her own. Here I am, she said aloud. I've been around the house, in and out the windows, and I danced. Elena? It was Luke's voice, and she thought, of all of them, I would least like to have Luke catch me. Don't let him see me, she thought beggingly, and turned and ran without stopping into the library. And here I am, she thought. Here I am inside. It was not cold at all, but deliciously fondly warm. It was light enough for her to see the iron stairway curving around and around up to the tower, and the little door at the top. Under her feet the stone floor moved carelessly, rubbing itself against the soles of her feet, and all around the soft air touched her, stirring her hair, drifting against her fingers, coming in a light breath across her mouth, and she danced in circles. No stone irons for me, she thought, no Orlandos. I have broken the spell of Hill House, and somehow come inside. I am home, she thought, and I stopped in wonder at the thought. I am home, she thought. Now to climb. Climbing the narrow iron stairway was intoxicating, going higher and higher, around and around, looking down, clinging to the slim iron railing, looking far, far down onto the stone floor. Climbing, looking down, she thought of the soft green grass outside and the rolling hills and the rich trees. Looking up, she thought of the tower of Hill House rising triumphantly between the trees, tall over the road which wound through hillside and past the white house set in flowers, and past the magic ordalias, and past the stone irons, and on, far, far away, to a little lady who was going to pray for her. Time is ended now, she thought. All that is gone and left behind, and that poor little lady praying still for me. For a minute she could not remember who they were. Had they been guests of hers in the house of the stone irons, dining at her long table in the candlelight? Had she met them at the inn over the stumbling stream? Had one of them come riding down a green hill, banners flying? Had one of them run beside her in the darkness? And then she remembered, and they fell into place where they belonged. And she hesitated, clinging to the railing. They were so small, so ineffectual. They stood far below on the stone floor and pointed at her. They called to her, and their voices were urgent and far away. Luke, she said, remembering. They could hear her, because they were quiet when she spoke. Dr. Montague, she said. Mrs. Montague. Arthur. She could not remember the other, who stood silent and a little apart. Elena, Dr. Montague called. Turn around very carefully and come slowly down the stairs. Move very, very slowly, Elena. Hold on to the railing all the time. Now turn and come down. What on earth is the creature doing? Mrs. Montague demanded. Her hair was in curlers, and her bathrobe had a dragon on the stomach. Make her come down so we can go back to bed, Arthur. Make her come down at once. See here, Arthur began, and Luke moved to the foot of the stairway and started up. For God's sakes, be careful, the doctor said as Luke moved steadily on. The thing is rotted away from the wall. It won't hold both of you, Mrs. Montague said possibly. You'll have it down on our heads. Arthur, move over here near the door. Elena, the doctor called, can you turn around and start down slowly? Above her was only the little trapdoor leading out into the turret. She stood on the little narrow platform at the top, and pressed against the trapdoor, but it would not move. Frighteningly, she hammered against it with her fists, thinking wildly, make it open, or they'll catch me. Glancing over her shoulder, she could see Luke climbing steadily around and around. Elena, he said, stand still, don't move, and he sounded frightened. I can't get away, she thought, and looked down. She saw one face clearly, and the name came into mind. Theodora, she said. Now, do as they tell you, please. Theodora, I can't get out. The door's been nailed shut. Damn right it's been nailed shut, Luke said. And lucky for you too, my gal. Coming very slowly, he had almost reached the narrow platform. Stay perfectly still, he said. Stay perfectly still, Elena, the doctor said. Now, Theodora said, please do what they say. Why? Elena looked down and saw the dizzy fall of the tower below her, the iron stairway clinging to the tower walls, shaking and straining under Luke's feet, the cold stone floor, the distant, pale, staring faces. How can I get down? She asked helplessly. Doctor, how can I get down? Move very slowly, he said. Do what Luke tells you. Now, Theodora said, don't be frightened. It will be all right. Really. Of course it will be all right, Luke said grimly. Probably it will only be my neck that gets broken. Hold on now. I'm coming onto the platform. I want to get past you so you can go down ahead of me. He seemed hardly out of breath in spite of climbing, but his hand trembled as he reached out to take hold of the railing, and his face was wet. Come on, he said sharply. Elena hung back. The last time you told me to go ahead, you never followed, she said. Perhaps I will just push you over the edge, Luke said. Let you smash down there on the floor. Now behave yourself and move slowly. Get past me and start down the stairs. And just hope, he added furiously, that I can resist the temptation to give you a shove. Meekly she came along the platform and pressed herself against the hard stone wall while Luke moved courteously past her. Start down, he said. I'll be right behind you. Precociously, the iron stairway shaking and groaning with every step she felt her way. She looked at her hand on the railing, white because she was holding so tight, and at her bare feet going one step at a time, step by step, moving with extreme care, but never looked down again to the stone floor. Go down very slowly, she told herself over and over, not thinking of more than the steps which seemed almost to bend and buckle beneath her feet. Go down very, very slowly. Steady, Luke said behind her. Take it easy now. Nothing to be afraid of. We're almost there. Involuntarily below her, the doctor and Theodora held out their arms as though ready to catch her if she fell. And once, when Elena stumbled and missed a step, the handrail wavering as she clung to it, Theodora gasped and ran to hold the end of the stairway. It's all right, Nellie, she said over and over. It's all right. It's all right. Only a little further, the doctor said. Creeping, Elena slid her feet down, one step after the other, and at last, almost before she could believe it, stepped off onto the stone floor. Behind her, the stairway rocked and clanged as Luke leaped down the last few steps and walked steadily across the room to fall against a chair and stop, head down and trembling still. Elena turned and looked up to the infinitely high little spot where she had been standing at the iron stairway, warped and crooked and swaying against the tower wall, and said in a small voice, I ran up all the way. Mrs. Montague moved purposely forward from the doorway where she and Arthur had been sheltering against the probable collapse of the stairway. Does anybody agree with me, she asked with great decency, in thinking that this young woman has given us enough trouble tonight? I, for one, would like to go back to bed, and so would Arthur. Hill House, the doctor began. This childish nonsense has almost certainly destroyed any chance of manifestations tonight, I can tell you. I certainly do not look to see any of our friends from beyond after this ridiculous performance. So if you will all excuse me, and if you are sure that you are finished with your posturing and performing and waking up busy people, I will say good night. Arthur. Mrs. Montague swept out, dragon rampant, quivering with indignation. Luke was scared, Elena said, looking at the doctor and Theodora. Luke was most certainly scared. He agreed from behind her. Luke was so scared he almost didn't get himself down from there. Now, what an imbecile you are. Oh, I really feel bad for her now. I would be inclined to agree with Luke. The doctor was displeased, and Elena looked away, looked at Theodora, and Theodora said, I suppose you had to do it now. I'm all right, Elena said, and could not longer look at any of them. She looked surprised down at her own bare feet, realizing suddenly that they had carried her unfeeling down the iron stairway. She thought, looking at her feet, and then raised her head. I came down to the library to get a book, she said. It was humiliating, disastrous. Nothing was said at breakfast, and Elena was served coffee and eggs and rolls just like the others. She was allowed to linger over her coffee with the rest of them, observe the sunlight outside, comment upon the good day ahead. For a few minutes she might have been persuaded to believe that nothing had happened. Luke passed her the marmalade. Theodora smiled at her over Arthur's head. The doctor bowed her good morning. Then, after breakfast, after Mrs. Dudley's entrance at 10, they came without comment, following one another silently to the little parlour, and the doctor took his position before the fireplace. Theodora was wearing Elena's red sweater. Luke, will you bring your car around? The doctor said gently. In spite of what he was saying, his eyes were considerate and friendly. Theodora, will you go up and pack for you? Elena giggled. She can't. She won't have anything to wear. Now, Theodora began and stopped and glanced at Mrs. Montague, who shrugged her shoulders and said, I examined the room. Naturally, I can't imagine why none of you thought to do it. I was going to, the doctor said apologetically, but I thought. You always think, John, and that's your trouble. Naturally, I examined the room at once. Theodora's room, Luke asked. I wouldn't like to go in there again. Mrs. Montague sounded surprised. I can't think why not, she said. There's nothing wrong with it. I went in and looked at my clothes, Theodora said to the doctor. They're perfectly fine. The room needs dusting, naturally, but what can you expect if you lock the door and Mrs. Dudley cannot? The doctor's voice rose over his wife's. Cannot tell you how sorry I am, he was saying. If there was ever anything I could do. Elena laughed. But I can't leave, she said, wondering where to find words to explain. You have been here quite long enough, the doctor said. Theodora stared at her. I don't need your clothes, she said patiently. Didn't you just hear Mrs. Montague? I don't need your clothes, and even if I did, I wouldn't wear them now. Now you've got to go away from here. But I can't leave, Elena said, laughing still because it was so perfectly impossible to explain. Madam, Luke said sombrely, you are no longer welcome as my guest. Perhaps Arthur had better drive her back to the city. Arthur could see that she gets there safely. Gets where? Elaine shook her head at them, feeling her lovely heavy hair around her face. Gets where? She asked happily. Why, the doctor said, home, of course. And Theodora said, now, your own little place. Your own apartment where all your things are. And Elena laughed. I haven't any apartment, she said to Theodora. I made it up. I sleep on a cot at my sister's in the baby's room. I haven't any home, no place at all. And I can't go back to my sister's because I stole her car. She laughed, hearing her own words. So inadequate and so unutterably sad. I haven't any home, she said again, and regarded them hopefully. No home. Everything in all the world that belongs to me is in a carton in the back of my car. That's all I have. Some books and things I had when I was a little girl, and a watch my mother gave me. So you see, there's no place you can send me. I could, of course, go on, she wanted to tell them, seeing always their frightened, staring faces. I could go on, leaving my clothes for Theodora. I could go wandering and homeless, errant, and I would always come back here. It would be simpler to let me stay, more sensible, she wanted to tell them happily. I would stay here, she said to them. I've already spoken to the sister, Mrs. Montague said importantly. I must say, she asked first about the car. A vulgar person, I told her she need to have no fear. You were very wrong, John, to let her steal her sister's car and come here. My dear, Dr. Montague began and stopped, spreading his hands helplessly. At any rate, she is expected. The sister was almost annoyed at me because they had planned to go off on their vacation together. although why she should be annoyed at me. Mrs. Montague scowled at Elena. I do think someone ought to have to see her safely into their hands, she said. The doctor shook his head. It would be a mistake, he said slowly. It would be a mistake to send one of us off with her. She must be allowed to forget everything about this house as soon as she can. We cannot prolong the association. Once again from here, she will be herself. Can you find your way home? He asked Elena, and Elena laughed. I'll go and get that packing done, Theodora said. Luke, check the car and bring it around. She's only got one suitcase. Walled up alive, Elena began to laugh again at their stone faces. Walled up alive, she said. I want to stay here. They made a solid line along the steps of Hill House, guarding the door. Beyond their heads she could see the windows looking down, and to one side the tower waited confidently. She might have cried if she could have thought of any way of telling them why. Instead she smiled brokenly up at the house, looking at her own window, at the amused curtained face of the house, watching her quietly. The house was waiting now, she thought, and it was waiting for her. No one else could satisfy it. The house wants me to stay, she told the doctor, and he stared at her. He was standing very stiff and with great dignity, as though he expected her to choose him instead of the house, as though, having brought her here, he thought that by unwinding his directions he could send her back again. His back was squarely turned to the house, and looking at her honestly, she said, I'm sorry, I'm terribly sorry, really. I guess he did have dignity, yeah. You'll go to Hillsdale, he said leavenly. Perhaps he was afraid of saying too much. Perhaps he thought that a kind word or a sympathetic one might rebound upon himself and bring her back. The sun was shining on the hills, the house and the garden, and the lawn and the trees and the brook. Elena took a deep breath and turned, seeing it all. In Hillsdale, turn on to Route 5, going east. At Ashton, you will meet Route 39, and that will take you home. For your own safety, he added with a kind of urgency, for your own safety, my dear, believe me, if I had foreseen this, I'm really terribly sorry, she said. We can't take chances, any chances. I am only beginning to perceive what a terrible risk, and I was asking of all of you. Now, he sighed and shook his head. You'll remember, he asked, to Hillsdale and then to Route 5. Look, Elena was quiet for a minute, wanting to tell them all exactly how it was. I wasn't afraid, she said at last. I really wasn't afraid. I'm fine now. I was happy. She looked earnestly at the doctor. Happy, she said. I didn't know what to say, she said, afraid again that she was going to cry. I don't want to go away from here. There might be a next time, the doctor said sternly. Can't you understand that we cannot take the chance? Elena faltered. Someone is praying for me, she said foolishly. A lady and I met a long time ago. The doctor's voice was gentle, but he tapped his foot impatiently. You must forget everything about. Okay, he tapped his foot impatiently. You will forget all of this quite soon, he said. You must forget everything about Hill House. I was so wrong to bring you here, he said. How long have we been here? Elena asked suddenly. A little over a week. Why? It's the only time anything's ever happened to me. I liked it. That said, the doctor is why you are leaving in such a hurry. Elena closed her eyes and sighed, feeling and hearing and smelling the house. A flowering bush beyond the kitchen was heavy with scent, and the water in the brook moved sparklingly over the stones. Far away upstairs, perhaps in the nursery, a little eddy of wind gathered itself and swept along the floor, carrying dust. In the library, the iron stairway swayed, and light glittered onto the marble eyes of Hugh Crane. Theodora's yellow shirt hung neat and unstained. Mrs. Dudley was setting the lunch table for 5. Hill House watched, arrogant and patient. I won't go away, Elena said to the high windows. You will go away, the doctor said, showing his impatience at last. Right now. Elena laughed and turned, holding out her hand. Luke, she said, and he came towards her, silent. Thank you for bringing me down last night, she said. That was wrong of me. I know it now, and you were very brave. I was indeed, Luke said. It was an act of courage far surpassing any other in my life. I am glad to see you going now, because I would certainly never do it again. Well, it seems to me, Mrs. Montague said, if you're going, you'd better get on with it. I've no query with saying goodbye, although I personally feel that you've got an exaggerated view of this place. But I do think we've got better things to do than stand here arguing when we all know you've got to go. You'll be a time as it is, getting back to the city, and your sister waiting to go on her vacation. Arthur nodded. Tearful farewells, he said. What a knob Arthur is. Don't hold with them myself. Far away, in the little parlour, the ash dropped softly in the fireplace. John, Mrs. Montague said. Possibly it would be better if Arthur. No, the doctor said strongly. Elena has to go back the way she came. And who do I thank for a lovely time? Elena asked. The doctor took her by the arm and, with Luke beside her, led her to the car and opened the door for her. The carton was still on the back seat. Her suitcase was on the floor, her coat and pocketbook on the seat. Luke had left the motor running. Doctor, Elena said, clutching at him. Doctor, I'm sorry, he said. Goodbye. Drive carefully, Luke said politely. You can't just make me go, she said wildly. You brought me here. And I am sending you away, the doctor said. We won't forget you, Elena, but right now the important thing for you is to forget Hill House and all of us. Goodbye. Goodbye, Mrs. Montague said firmly from the steps, and Arthur said, Goodbye, have a good trip. Then Elena, her hand on the door of the car, stopped and turned. Theo, she said inquiringly, and Theodora ran down the steps to her. I thought you weren't going to say goodbye to me, she said. Oh, Nelly, my now. Be happy, please be happy. Don't worry, forget me. Someday things really will be all right again, and you'll write me letters, and I'll answer, and we'll visit each other, and we'll have fun talking over the crazy things we did and saw and heard in Hill House. Oh, Nelly, I thought you weren't going to say goodbye to me. Goodbye, Elena said to her. Nelly, Theodora said timidly, and put out a hand to touch Elena's cheek. Listen, maybe Sunday we can meet here again and have our picnic by the brook. We never had a picnic, she told the doctor, and he shook his head, looking at Elena. Goodbye, Elena said to Mrs. Montague. Goodbye, Arthur. Goodbye, Doctor. I hope your book is very successful. Luke, she said, goodbye and goodbye. Now, Theodora said, please be careful. Goodbye, Elena said, and slid into the car. It felt unfamiliar and awkward. I am too used already to the comforts of Hill House, she thought, and reminded herself to wave a hand from the car window. Goodbye, she called, wondering if there had ever been another word for her to say. Goodbye, goodbye. Clumsily, her hands fumbling, she released the brake and let the car move slowly. They waved back at her dutifully, standing still, watching her. They will watch me down the drive as far as they can see, she thought. It is only civil for them to look at me until I am out of sight. So now I am going. Journeys end in lovers' meeting. But I won't go, she thought, and laughed aloud to herself. Hill House is not as easy as they are. Just by telling me to go away, they can't make me leave. Not if Hill House means me to stay. Pardon me. Go away, Elena, she chanted aloud. Go away, Elena. We don't want you any more. Not in our Hill House. Go away, Elena. You can't stay here. But I can, she sang. But I can. They don't make the rules around here. They can't turn me out or shut me out or laugh at me or hide from me. I won't go, and Hill House belongs to me. With what she perceived as quick cleverness, she pressed her foot down hard on the accelerator. They can't run fast enough to catch me this time, she thought. But by now they must be beginning to realize. I wonder who notices first. Luke, almost certainly. I can hear them calling now, she thought, and the little footsteps running through Hill House, and the soft sound of the hills pressing closer. I am really doing it, she thought, turning the wheel to send the car directly at the great tree at the curve of the driveway. I am really doing it. I am really doing this by myself now. At last, this is me. I am really, really, really doing it by myself. In the unending crashing second before the car heard into the tree, she thought clearly, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? Why don't they stop me? Mrs. Sanderson was enormously relieved to hear that Dr. Montague and his party had left Hill House. She would have turned them out, she told the family lawyer. If Dr. Montague had shown any sign of wanting to stay, Theodora's friend, mortified and Cruty, was delighted to see Theodora back so soon. Luke took himself off to Paris, where his aunt frequently hoped he would stay for a while. Dr. Montague finally retired from active scholarly pursuits after the cool, almost contemporaneous reception of his primarily article analysing the psychic phenomena of Hill House. Hill House itself, not sane, stood against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years, and might stand for 80 more. Within its walls continued upright bricks, neatly floors were firm and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and the stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone. And that is the end. I hope you guys enjoyed me reading this on stream over several streams, and I will definitely do another book read in the future. I'll have to have a think of what to read, and I'll probably put up a poll, maybe giving a few choices, but definitely won't be the last read through of a book on streams. But yeah, I really had a good time reading that. It was the first time read for me, and yeah, went in some surprising directions. So thanks everyone for checking out the stream tonight, and I will be back with a film watch tomorrow, which is Die Hard with a Vengeance. So maybe see some of you there. Take care, see you soon.